Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us. My name is Matt Ferreira, Manager of Coach Education, Player Development, and Club Licensing with Ontario Soccer. Pleased to be your host today for this educational session as we return to play. With the announcement of return to play moving into step 2 toward the end of this month, we wanted to provide further support and education for coaches so we can enhance the player experience while safeguarding their health and physical well-being as they hit the pitch. Just as a quick housekeeping reminder, your microphones will be muted and your cameras will be maintained off. Throughout and at the end of the session, though, you will have the opportunity to provide your questions through the chat function, which we'll moderate at the end for an open Q&A for the last half hour. Now, without further ado, I'm delighted to introduce you to our presenter today, who will be leading us through the session, Coming Back Better, Optimal Load Management for Return to Play. His name is none other than Richard Bucciarelli. For those of you that don't know, he's a professional fitness coach, sports scientist, coach developer with Ontario Soccer, and the owner of Soccer Fitness Inc., a soccer-specific strength and conditioning company in Toronto. Richard's worked at some of the highest levels of the game, both in Canada and internationally, including some of the national teams, Toronto FC Academy, the Uruguay Segunda, and the United Soccer League team with the Ottawa Fury, and several other Canadian college and university teams. He's in the process right now of completing his PhD, or already completed it. Richard, I'll let you speak to that afterwards.
Still working on it, banging my head against the wall.
Right on.
Working on it.
In human health and nutritional sciences with a specialty in biomechanics of speed and acceleration training in soccer players at the University of Guelph. He's presented his research at some of the world's largest and most prestigious soccer-specific sports science and coaching conferences around the world, including none other than the Ontario Soccer Summit, as well as other world conferences. He's an avid author, lecturer, and coach educator. He holds certifications in FIFA 11 Plus, Sport for Life movement preparation, and as already mentioned, an Ontario Soccer coach developer. He's currently working as a professor of exercise science and physiology at George Brown, as well as providing services in the C license and the soccer fitness trainer course with Ontario and Canada Soccer. Now, Richard, stage is yours, and we'll let our audience shift their mindset and get their attention focused on return to play.
Okay, well, thank you, Matt, for the introduction, and everyone at Ontario Soccer, for having me, and of course, thank you to everyone that's in attendance live and anyone who couldn't make it live, maybe that's going to be watching, the videos after. I always have to thank any coach that comes and participates in the courses that I teach or the presentations or webinars that I give. I know how difficult and challenging it is to give up your time away from work, away from family, to make sacrifices in order to do this job. I know it because I've done it too, and I'm still doing it. And so, obviously I understand and I really, respect and value, the commitment that you've made to be here and listen to me. And I hope that you do get some good, valuable knowledge and practical, tangible stuff that you can take back, to your clubs and your teams that you're working with. And of course, in addition to, me saying thank you, I really do hope that we can make this kind of an interactive discussion as much as we can. I want you to learn from me and what I'm saying, but I'd like to learn from you as well. And I know I've spoken to Matt about, if you do have questions anytime throughout me speaking, please feel free to use the chat box, ask, and we'll try to make it an interactive dialogue as much as we can. And also, I'm going to leave quite a bit of time at the end of this for more questions and answers, because I'm sure that there probably will be some. So with that out of the way, this is the title. The topic is called Coming Back Better, Optimal Load Management for Return to Play. We're kind of in uncharted territory here with soccer. I know that, I'm sure I'm not telling you anything new that you need to plan and periodize your training for a preseason. But this is not a normal preseason for two reasons. The first, of course, obviously, is that there really hasn't been any kind of normal functioning soccer training for over a year. It's been about maybe 16 months or so since the original lockdown started. And I know that there were, quite a lot of clubs and academies and programs that opened up, in the spring and summer and even in the fall of last year. but it was limited. There were restrictions, there were further lockdowns, and everyone was kind of all over the place. And as I said, I know it because I've experienced it too. So, that's the first reason, is that, we're more or less, we're not quite sure what we're going to be getting when we see these players that come back to us. And the second, I guess, challenge, and the reason why I would almost call this a little bit uncharted territory, is the limited time window. Keep in mind, we're kind of talking and we're using this term preseason, but really in an ideal world, and in the traditional kind of OPDL schedule that most of you are used to, and any other competitive schedules that you're used to, you probably would end up having 4 weeks, 5 weeks, 6, maybe even up to 8 weeks of preseason, of kind of a dedicated time to devote to training, to exhibition matches, and tryouts and all of that. And now it's really shortened. It's only about 2 weeks. It might be a bit more. I know things are still being confirmed, but it's a short amount of time, which makes the planning, and of course the tracking and monitoring and management of load. That's what we're going to talk about today. Not just planning, but managing, makes it more challenging. So we're all in uncharted territory. Hopefully, at the end of this hour and a half, you feel maybe a little more well-equipped, a little more confident to go into that uncharted territory than you were before. And I'm hoping to help you with that. So with that out of the way, the overview, it's a fairly simple outline. There's 3 things we're going to talk about. The first is periodization of training. It's a bit of a buzzword. A lot of people use it. A lot of people use it in sports science. A lot of people use it in soccer. I'm going to hopefully maybe give some clarity and useful information around that word and how to use it in soccer. Okay, then we're going to talk about training load, because of course, when you're talking about periodization basically means planning. It's a fancy word for planning, and planning training, of course, involves more than just the physical or physiological load. There's technical and tactical elements as well, and even psychological elements. But for my area of expertise, and what I'm going to speak about today, is going to be about the physical side of periodization of planning, and all of that is centered around this concept of training load. I'm going to show you how, more or less, without understanding training load, you can't really accurately plan. And finally, we're going to talk a little bit about this, how to apply this theory and everything that you've learned into the upcoming 2-week preseason. I've called it 2 weeks. I know I actually spoke to Matt yesterday that maybe it may be a little bit longer. In any case, the guidelines, the information I'm going to give you will be applicable to 2 weeks, but of course you can also follow them and use them if the time period is longer. There's nothing in here that's unique to 2 weeks. So that's what we'll speak about. Okay, and as I said, we'll go ahead and get started with an introduction to this term periodization. So you're going to see some technical definitions to start with, and I'm going to highlight a couple of things within these definitions that hopefully we can discuss a little bit. So first of all, it's the systematic planning of athletic or physical training. Systematic is an important word because it implies that there is some type of a system that's being followed. There's some logic and reason. You're not just planning training in the car ride on the way into the session. There's some type of systematic element to it, and of course that makes it more organized and makes it more likely that you're going to get better results. Okay, here's something that again I'd like to, hopefully we can stimulate a bit of a discussion on, which is that the aim of periodization is to reach the best possible performance, peak physical performance, in the most important competition of the year. And I have to say, when we speak about this word and the theory and methodology and science behind it, okay, we're talking about historically anyway, going back to the former Soviet Union. That's where a lot of this science was developed. And I'm just going to ask, and maybe I know Matt, coaches can type in the chat here. I just want to know, like, does anybody know what types of sports was this science of periodization really applied much more commonly to? What types of sports? Individual sports or team sports? I'd like to see if anybody can give me an answer to that, because that's going to inform a little bit more about what we talk about afterwards. I don't know if I can see the chat here.
Richard.
Yes.
Yep. So some of the responses I'm seeing are individual.
Yeah.
Olympic sports.
Yeah. So I think we got the idea that, and if you know, if anybody either was, you know, alive back in the, you know, 70s and 80s, and, you know, or has read about it or heard about it, you know, you would know that the former Soviet Union, you know, they were very successful in many of the individual sports, and of course a lot of those were in the Olympics, things like weightlifting, swimming, track and field, you know, wrestling, and what's important about that, and important to know, is that, again, like, you know, this sentence here that talks about where the aim of a periodized of a systematically planned physical training program, it is to reach peak physical performance in the most important competition of the year. And in those individual sports, like swimming, like track and field, gymnastics, etc., you can isolate and you can say, okay, well, there's one or maybe two most important competitions throughout the year. If it's an Olympic year, it might be the, you know, the Olympic qualifiers or the World Championships, and then the Olympics themselves. And typically there's quite a lot of time in between those two. And if it's not an Olympic year, it might just be the World Championships, or maybe a big meet or competition. So there might only be one or two or maybe three top competitions throughout the year, most important. And the science is all geared around getting athletes in top physical condition for those competitions, because that's the way it works. And, you know, I'll ask this question and I'll answer it myself. I know it's a little difficult to do this with the chat like this, but, you know, is it possible? The question is it possible for a soccer player or another team sport athlete who has multiple competitions throughout the year in a season that lasts 6 months, 8 months, maybe more? Is it possible for a team sport athlete to be in top peak physical condition for that amount of time, or even for, let's say, 1 month or 2 months of the year? And the answer to that is no. It's really not possible. This is one of the reasons actually why even the Olympic Games are done in the schedule that they are. You'll see competitions, you know, the first qualifying heats may start in track and field on a certain day, and, you know, the next round might be a couple of days later. It's almost finished within a 7-day, you know, like a 1 week or 10-day time period, sometimes even less, is because that's the maximum amount of time that an athlete can be in their top physical condition. You can try it with yourselves or your athletes if you do lots of testing, and what you'll see is that there's no way that, you know, the maximum vertical jump height or sprint speed, you know, these characteristics, there's no way that an athlete is going to reach their maximum level and stay there throughout the whole season. It's not realistic. And so, you know, it's important to know, and as we talk about this topic a bit more, it's important to know and to remember that this is a science that was developed in order to get athletes to a peak physical condition over a very short window of time. And it's now being applied to something which it wasn't designed for, which is getting athletes into very good physical condition and then trying very hard to maintain that over a long, long period of time. It's not easy to do. And, you know, a concept that I bring up quite often when I teach this topic at the university level or in courses here is that typically the mistakes, or the, you know, kind of the errors in planning that are made, they lead to one of two outcomes. And I got my hands on the screen here. I hope you can see me. That outcome number one is where the training load, the stimulus presented to the players, the lack of recovery, etc., everything is too high, which means that you get overtraining, you get sickness or injury. That's if it's too high. And the other error in planning, and I think maybe my experience anyway in Canadian soccer, Ontario soccer, this is a little more common, is that it's actually too low, okay, not hard enough, and that leads to no improvements. And so those are, you know, those are kind of the two errors in physical training that can occur throughout the soccer season. And our goal with periodization is to take this science designed for individual sports, apply it to team sports, so we can get in the middle, okay, in between overtraining and undertraining, get players to improve and maintain and not get hurt. So anyway, that's it's a long way to speak just about one little sentence. And of course, the final thing just to keep in mind about periodization, literally the word period is in there, meaning period of time. So you've got cycles, okay, of varying aspects of training or of a training program throughout a specific period of time. Okay, so that's, those are the technical definitions of periodization. And really, periodization are, it's really centered around these three principles, which we're going to get into right now. And the first one is the principle of overload. So the principle of overload states that in order for an adaptation to occur to a physiological system, the system must be presented with a stimulus that overloads the system. So we look at the picture on the right, okay? It's fairly easy to tell who's being overloaded. It must be the person on the right, because the person on the left is not being challenged enough, okay, in order to overload the muscles in the arm, the physiological system. It's the more or less muscular strength in this case, okay? So the person on the left is not going to improve because he is not receiving an overload, whereas the person on the right potentially will if he gets enough recovery. That's important to know. I've spoken about this. I've written about this before. This topic that comes up sometimes, which is overtraining. I think it's a popular topic, and my opinion is that I think often we as coaches are a little too concerned with overtraining. We think that players are training too much and they're doing too much, and as a result of that, we kind of decrease what they do. We cut out numbers of practices and so on. And I'm not saying that you should never do that, but what I am saying is that oftentimes, remember I talked about kind of a common error that's made, is if you don't, do enough to overload players, then you get into that undertraining. They never improve. And, how do I know that this is at least a bit of a challenge in Ontario? Because I've done lots of fitness testing in Ontario, and I see a lot of times that the player's fitness isn't always as high as it should be. And there's no way that a player can have a low level of fitness and be overtrained. That's not possible. So anyway, if players are hurt a lot and they're not fit, then the reason that they're getting hurt is not because they're overtraining. It's actually because they're undertraining and they're not fit. So in any case, in order to get fit, you need overload. And you have to really understand that because if you don't, and you don't overload your players systematically in training, then they will never improve. And actually their risk of injury will go up because they won't be fit enough to handle the demands of competitive games when they start. So it's very important to remember that principle, overload. The second principle we're going to speak about is the principle of specificity. So the principle of specificity, again, we're talking about stimuli, training stimuli, okay? The stimuli applied to a physiological system will elicit adaptations that match or are specific to these stimuli. This is very important when it comes to training for soccer. So again, maybe Lyndon, you can hopefully field these questions. I just want to ask, because there's only one answer to this. What's the most specific way to do physical training for soccer? There's only one answer to it. It's a simple answer, but what's the most specific way? Anybody, please type in the chat. We'll give it a 30 seconds or so. Or Matt, yeah.
Playing soccer is what's coming through right now.
Okay, very good. You've got it. Okay, so I'm not telling anyone anything that they don't know. Playing soccer is the one and only most specific way to train any physical or physiological system for a soccer player, of course, because what you do when you play soccer is you do the exact movements, the exact running, you get the exact everything, changes of direction, contact with other players, decision making, everything as specific to soccer as possible. Does that mean that you should just get on the pitch in training and play 11v11 and think, oh, okay, we're doing specific training? No, you need to manipulate the variables. A great way to do it, of course, is with small-sided games or other exercises that involve, of course, that involve the ball, but also that involve, opponents and decision making. And it's a reason why, everything, even in the courses that I teach with Ontario Soccer, everything is tied directly into that GAG methodology and the idea of, incorporating soccer and incorporating decision making, not only into just training in general, but into physical training, because what you get is you get more specific adaptations. And those adaptations, it's not just that players become better at decision making and they become technically better. They also, the physical improvements that they can make, oftentimes, are better from making your physical training soccer, because the movements are more specific. Also, I just want to highlight, I mean, there may be even some discussion about this after. Does this mean you should never do isolated running? No. I mean, I'm sitting here in my facility now where we have very fast treadmills and we do running training. Does it mean you shouldn't do weight training to develop strength and power? No, of course. High level players, we're talking OPDL here, so they're past peak height velocity. Absolutely, they should be, doing a regular strength training program. It's important. It can develop qualities that are a little bit difficult to develop on the field, okay? But non-specific training and specific training are supplemental to each other. And we always have to remember that. There are things you can do on the field with soccer that there is no way you can do in a weight room or on a treadmill. And there are also things you can do in a weight room or on a treadmill that there is no way you can do in soccer. So in an ideal world, we've got both. The context of this presentation and what I'm talking about and the work that I do really with Ontario Soccer, it's about the specific part of it more than the non-specific part. And remember, you do get very, very specific adaptations to the training you make. Soccer is the most specific way to do it. So I'm glad we understand that. We can go on to the third principle. Also important, they're equally important, all three, and that's the principle of progression. I've got the picture of this person going up the stairs as a good visual for it. So the principle of progression states that in order to elicit positive adaptations, that's improvements, without the risk of sickness or injury, that's overtraining. So meaning in order to improve without overtraining, the overloads that are presented to each physiological system must be applied progressively with small incremental increases in volume and or intensity. We'll speak about what those are in a minute, but I want you to think about this and I guess, you know what, I wouldn't mind drawing on the screen here, but I won't draw. I'll just give you a question regarding this person on the staircase here. So I want you to imagine that each step represents a smaller, more incremental increase in training load from, let's say each step is 1 week. Week 1, 2, 3, up to the blue, 4, 5, and 6, right? So the athletes are training and they're starting on step 1 or week 1 with a certain load. What were to happen, or what do you think might happen if we were to cut out steps 2, 3, and 4, the 3 higher red steps, and we asked the athletes to go from step 1 all the way up to step 5, blue? What would happen? Again, we're talking conceptually here, but what would happen? So hopefully some answers are coming in. I think, again, it's fairly obvious. It should be common sense that if you ask an athlete to start with a low, volume or intensity, a low training load, and go immediately to a high volume, intensity, or training load without building up progressively, that the risk of sickness or injury goes up quite a lot. A lot of them can't make that jump. Maybe some can, but a lot can't. And you're not putting yourself in a good position planning physical training if you do that. And, this sounds like common sense, but the funny thing is that even though it sounds this way, and I'll tell you, I'm guilty of it too. I have been in the past. The more I learned about this, the less I do this. Okay. But a lot of us do this. We do this, for example, when players transition from the, Christmas break off season into training. Typically, we don't go step by step. We go straight into 3 or 4 days a week. And I don't know if as much attention is paid to training load as it should be all the time. Here's another good example. When players go, they graduate high school, they go from the club environment to university. Well, right away, you go from, a typical club environment, and maybe you're training 4 or 5 days a week. Intensity is a little bit varied, and you're playing against people who are the same age and the same size. And you go to university, what happens? You go to 2 practices a day. You go to a young 18-year-old with sometimes adults 2, 3, 4 years older, bigger and stronger. And of course, often what happens when young players, are freshmen in university and they get into a training camp, well, they get injured or they get sick because they're not quite physically prepared because coaches have asked them to do this big jump. And if anybody, let's say, remembers some of the presentations before from Raymond Verheyen, he was very, very direct about this point that, a university coach might see this and say, well, he or she is, they're just not prepared for this level. And the answer to that is, of course, they're not prepared. Of course, they're not prepared because nobody did anything either at the club level or at the university level to prepare them. Nobody put those steps in place to make the overloads progressive so that athletes can make those improvements that they need to get to the highest level, in a safe and healthy way. So as I said, this sounds like common sense, and I'm sure that when I asked that question about jumping from step 1 to step 5, everyone kind of said, yeah, no, it's not possible. It sounds like common sense, but it needs to be applied in a, with a common sense approach. I think a little bit more, and how do you do that? Well, you have to learn how to calculate training load, which we're going to talk about, and hopefully then you'll be better equipped to do it. So those are your 3 principles of periodization: overload, specificity, and progression. Everything revolves around those 3, hopefully to get athletes to the top fitness level that they can be, and then maintain it. So we'll talk about the what now. These are the energy systems. I got to be brief on this. This is a complex topic. We could talk about this for hours, but we obviously don't have the time, so we'll be brief, but hopefully we can at least differentiate. What are they? There are 3 of them. Soccer uses all 3. We'll start with anaerobic alactic. This is an energy system that provides energy for the short duration, high intensity actions that soccer players perform, and they perform a lot of them. Full sprints in a game, not all the time. Depends on the position and tactics and everything, but you may only see a player sprint 5, 6, maybe 10 times maximally in a game, but players do a lot of fast running. So that's not where they're going quite as fast as they can, but where they're going anywhere from 80, 90, up to 99% as fast as they can. At the top level, okay, we can speak about that to give some standards. Top level male players, they do almost 3 kilometers of fast running in a game. Top level female players, it's about 2 to 2.5, and it's getting higher. The women are getting more and more fit, from a lot of the, even the data and studies that were published 10, 15 years ago, the amount of high intensity running has literally almost doubled. They're not doing quite as much as the men yet, but in any case, it's a lot. We're talking 2 to 3 kilometers of fast running in every game. And every time you do a run, when you're doing it, you're using the alactic energy system. So of course, it's very important to train it. And going back to specificity, well, you need exercises, soccer exercises that force players to run a lot. Sometimes in an 11v11 game, you don't get that. That's why you need small-sided games. That's why you need exercises, sprint competitions with a shot at the end, or a dribbling 1v1, things like that make players run fast repeatedly. Okay. Second system, again, we're going briefly through this, but just so we understand the difference, is the anaerobic lactic energy system. As the name implies, this system provides energy for exercise that produces lactic acid. And what's the type of exercise that produces lactic acid? Well, it's when you sustain high intensity actions. So short duration in the alactic system, these are actions that are going to be anywhere from 0 to a maximum of 10 seconds. And most of the time in soccer, they're actually quite shorter than that. The runs in soccer are usually only 2 to 3 seconds in duration. But sometimes you have players, or even the team or a group of players, that have to work at a high intensity for a sustained period of time. A good visual, okay, and probably next time I do this presentation, I'll put a video in here, but a good visual for you will be, the teams that like to press in the attacking third. Okay, maybe, I guess, Argentina back in the 2000s used to do that a lot. You can think of Liverpool maybe would be a good example of a club team that does it. Okay, but we're talking about, usually it's not one player, it's a group of players that have to sprint to press. If they win the ball right away, that's great, but sometimes they don't. And if they don't, it means they may have to sustain that high intensity running for a longer period of time. And what you get when you do that is you get production of this, painful byproduct called lactic acid. Interrupts the ability of muscles to function properly. It causes fatigue, and no matter how fit you are, you're going to have to stop at some point to try to clear it out. So in any case, these two, the anaerobic alactic and the anaerobic lactic, they both involve high intensity actions. The difference is that the alactic system is providing energy for short duration actions, whereas the lactic system is providing energy for longer actions. And both of them, so that word anaerobic, you can translate it to say, contrary to the aerobic system, or the antithesis of the aerobic system, you don't use oxygen for energy with these systems. It doesn't mean that there's no oxygen available. So please don't tell your players that when they're working anaerobically, there's no oxygen, because if there's no oxygen, they would be dead. You need oxygen to, to survive. What it means is that they're working at such a high rate, so fast, they need energy so quickly that you can't get it from the oxygen that's available, and you need to use these other, well, basically glucose and a little bit of creatine, these molecules that are stored in the muscles for energy, not oxygen. That's why. And the third final system, which again we're going to speak about only briefly because we don't have a lot of time, but we will speak about it. That's the aerobic system. And the aerobic system provides energy in soccer for recovery in between the high intensity actions that you do. This is the system that utilizes the oxygen that you breathe in order to generate energy. Oxygen doesn't have energy in it, but when you breathe in oxygen, there are some processes that go on that eventually allow you to generate energy through oxidation, literally, the application of oxygen to these physiological processes. So you've got two systems where you don't use oxygen to provide energy. You've got one where you do, and the one where you do is helping you to recover in between all the other high intensity actions. So a player who has a good anaerobic system, that's a player who's fast and also can sustain sprinting over longer periods of time if needed. A player who has a good aerobic system is a player that recovers well in between those fast runs that they do, and therefore can do more. So really, ideally, of course, you want players that have, a good anaerobic system and a good aerobic system. And, I might, let's say, I could challenge, the coaches in here just to think about this a little bit. What's more important then, do you think, to performance? The aerobic system, the ability to recover, or the anaerobic system? And you don't need to type your answer. I want you to think about it, and I'll give you my, my opinion. I mean, this is kind of a good debate sometimes, but without a strong aerobic system, meaning you can't recover, there are almost no soccer players that can be successful at higher levels of play, because at higher levels of play you have to run a lot, you have to recover a lot. It's really not possible to do it without a strong aerobic system. Now, there may be some players that have a strong aerobic system and aren't the fastest, and unfortunately speed, I do a lot of work on training it, and it's great to train it. It's difficult to train. It's mostly genetic. So speed is mostly genetic. In an ideal world, you've got a player that's got a strong aerobic system and is fast and explosive, but sometimes you don't. And, that's okay too. But sometimes if that's the case, a player that, has a good aerobic system but isn't quite as fast, they still might be limited. And I know sometimes as coaches, we don't always want to admit this, but again, there's quite a lot of, evidence to show that at the higher levels of play, and as you progress, this is in male or female, right? As you progress from one level to the next, one characteristic that separates the players at the higher levels is that they are faster. And this is true if you go, amateur club to college or university, if you go Canadian college or university to American college or university, if you go American college or university to, professional, and even if you go professional to international. The players at the higher levels are faster. So what's more important? It's hard to say. It's difficult to get, to get anywhere without a good aerobic system, but it's also difficult to get anywhere, or to get to the higher levels anyway. It still can be difficult if you're not fast. So you need all three. You need to train all three. We're not going to speak a lot about the details of how to train them, but go back to your principle of specificity, and you can see right here. Well, if you want to train the alactic system, what are you going to need? You're going to need short duration, high intensity actions in your session, and you're going to need sufficient recovery in between them so players don't get fatigued and start, accumulating lactic acid. If you want to train the anaerobic lactic system, you're going to need to sustain high intensity actions. This is actually a challenge in our course, how to design training sessions for this. I mentioned pressing. So often to train this system, it's quite effective to do some exercise where a group of players is asked to defend, maybe with man-to-man marking, maybe literally with pressing if you want, or just to defend in a numbers down situation. Because in a numbers down situation, the defenders have to work a little bit harder. And every defender has to work hard, or else they're going to get split or penetrated. So in any case, you can train the alactic system with exercises that have short duration, high intensity sprints. You can train the anaerobic system with some type of sustained high intensity action. You're going to need a lot of recovery between repetitions. And you can train the aerobic system with exercises that involve some type of game. Okay, again, the context of this presentation, we're not going to speak a lot about it, but some type of game or activity. It could last a minute, could last up to 4 or 5, up to 10 minutes even, and controlled amounts of recovery in between. If you allow too much recovery, this is where we get into that mistake in training: too much rest, too much coaches talking, not enough movement, heart rates go down, etc. If you allow too much recovery in between your games or activities, then you don't get enough stimulus to the aerobic system, and the aerobic system doesn't improve. So that's a bit of a crash course, let's say, in energy systems. Hope that was helpful for you. And again, of course, you'll have access to this presentation later if you want more information. So the good news is that you can train all 3 of these energy systems: the alactic, the anaerobic alactic, the anaerobic lactic, and the aerobic system, with a simple activity pattern in your training. And that activity pattern is sprint, rest, sprint. Now, when I say sprint, I don't actually mean that they have to stand on a line and sprint 20 meters. It means anything where players are working at a high intensity. It can be a sprint exercise. It can be, as I said, some type of speed competition with a shot or a 1v1 at the end of it. It can be even a passing exercise or something that involves an overlapping run, or anything that makes players run. Or of course, it can be a small-sided game that has sprints or high intensity actions in it. Then a period of rest. And the rest can be active or passive. If it's active, it means with the ball, maybe doing something lower intensity, whatever. If it's passive, it literally just means, they're so tired they need to catch their breath. And then another sprint. So you repeat sprinting, resting, and sprinting. If you ask yourself the question, you don't need to answer it, but just conceptually, you can think, does that sound like soccer? Sprint, rest, sprint? Well, yes, it does. That's what you do in soccer. Does it sound like what you might see in a small-sided game? Yes, it does. Because in a small-sided game, you'll have periods where you're on the ball or making a run, where you're working harder, and periods where you're working lower or resting. And of course, does it sound like any type of other exercise that might have decision making? Yes, you can design exercises to look like that too. So back to your principle of specificity. The most specific way to train any physiological system in soccer, sorry, there's some construction going on. The most specific way to train any physiological system in soccer is by playing soccer. The way to do it is by following this activity pattern: sprint, rest, sprint, because that's specifically how soccer looks. And you can train all 3 energy systems with that same pattern. You just manipulate how long each sprint or high intensity action is, how intense it is, and how much rest you give in between. So again, it's an oversimplification, but that's what you're planning throughout each week, throughout each cycle, throughout each phase. So we'll hopefully get back to that in a minute. I'm going to ask a question. This should be, self-evident, let's say. Okay, but the question is, which one of these 2 training models, okay, we've got, on the y-axis, on the vertical axis, we've got intensity, or you can think load, okay, from 1 to 3, 1 being low, 3 being high. And then we've got days of the week on the x-axis, on the horizontal axis. Which one, as a coach, do you prefer? Let's hope some questions come in. As I said, I feel like it, could be obvious. Hopefully, Matt, we're getting 1 or 2 that are giving me this correct answer here. Yes, good. Okay, very good. Option 2. Why? Because what you're doing in this option is you're varying the training load and you're making it look more like a wave. You've got days where the load is higher and you've got days where the load is lower. And what does that allow for? Well, it allows for recovery. And something interesting, okay, anybody who's like into math here, okay, you might have heard of the term fractal. So when you talk about fractals and you apply it, we can apply it to this, but in any case, A fractal, when you apply it to any system, means that something very small in the system resembles something very big in the system, and vice versa. So remember I said that the most specific way to train for soccer, because that's what soccer looks like, is sprint, rest, sprint. Intervals of high intensity exercise followed by recovery, and then high intensity exercise again. That's what soccer looks like. That's what you want. That's what you want training to look like. So if that's what soccer looks like and that's what training looks like, then when you look at a week can also follow the same pattern, where you've got a period of time in the week where the load is higher, and then another period of time in the week where the load is lower, and it recovers and it goes up and down. It's wave-like. So the very small, the workout, the training session can also look like a week with multiple training sessions. And then we can go back to even a larger period of time. We can even talk about, let's say, a month or a monthly cycle, where again, a large period of time, a month, has the same fluctuations or wave-like patterns of higher and then lower load. That's the way that you get good results, that you get overload to the system, but without the risk of overtraining, sickness, and injury. So hopefully that makes sense to you. That's the way you want each training week to look. And again, it sounds like common sense, but I'll just draw attention, because this is just from my own experience. I lived through this in university here in Canada 20 years ago, and maybe some of you also have as players or as coaches. This was not the way. Now, maybe now things are changing, but this was not the way, as an example, not the way that university soccer used to be planned. University soccer used to look a lot more like the schedule on the left, where it was every single day, 2 practices a day, where the load was very high. And of course, with that very high training load, you didn't really have a lot of time to recover. A lot of players got hurt. And again, just a simple, anecdotal example, but I think anyone who's watching, if you ever, remember if you played in Canada anyway in university, I mean, I got a cold every year in September for 5 years in a row. And the first year I was kind of confused, didn't make sense. I thought I was very healthy, and eventually I kind of thought, oh well, it makes sense. I'm training very hard, harder than I was in the summer anyway, and you lose a bit of weight. Of course, you still have school, your immune system gets a little bit suppressed, you may not sleep as much as you want, and what happens? Well, you get sick. So that's overtraining, that's what it is. And that's the schedule on the left. Should be common sense, but isn't always. We want the schedule on the right because that involves progressive overload. So now, my suggestion is to limit to 2 high load training sessions in a week, no more. Why? Because you need time to recover. If you're in a week where you have no games, then you can have both of those high load sessions as training. If you're in a week where you have a game, the game is going to have to count as a high load training. And what that means is that you only have one other high load training throughout the week. That's the way to do it. So we'll move on and we'll just talk a little bit about monthly. And remember, I mentioned that concept of fractal, where everything is following kind of a wave-like pattern. Okay. So this is the best model for soccer. Okay. Again, this is an oversimplification because we don't have a lot of time to talk about it. I'm probably already behind. Okay. But the nonlinear model, that's where you fluctuate and you alternate. You don't just make training load. It's not really like that staircase that I showed you. It's wave-like. Okay. And what you get with that model is you get, again, a wave-like intensity pattern. You get volume and load being altered more frequently. On the days where the volume is high, sometimes the intensity is lower, and vice versa. And you can train multiple energy systems each week. Why is that important? Because in soccer, you need a well-functioning, you need all 3 energy systems to be well-functioning. So you need to be able to train them every week. You can't neglect them. That's where we go back to the science of periodization being much more, geared towards individual sports, where they can spend 6 weeks only training for speed and agility or power and neglect aerobic fitness. They can do that in individual sports. You cannot do that in soccer. So this model works much better in soccer. You also get lighter loads more often, so you get more recovery. It's better for longer soccer season. Something that you may hear or see a lot about now is that, you know, in my profession, you know, fitness coaches, sports scientists, a lot of times at the higher levels, we're kind of judged and evaluated more by how healthy we can keep players rather than by the physical performance, especially, you know, in the top levels of the game. A lot of players are in their late 20s or 30s. They're not really able to, you know, they can't make too many improvements in fitness, but you can certainly keep them healthy by managing recovery and neuromuscular recovery and everything. So it's important. And again, I said it's ideal for soccer because because soccer requires you to train all three energy systems, and soccer also has multiple competitions throughout the year. So this model it fits much better with soccer. Okay, and again, we don't have time to get into too much more detail about it, but you know, nonlinear literally means it just doesn't go up in a straight line. There's a wave-like pattern, and remember the fractal. A workout looks like that, a week looks like that, and months or phases can look like that too. So I mentioned a few times, you know, if you want more information, well, here's a way you can get it. You know, it's we'll call it a shameless plug, I guess, but it's a great course. You know, I teach this course, but I really, you know, it's really valuable for coaches. This is information you're just not going to get in the licensing program. Nothing wrong with our coach licensing. It's great, but you know, everybody's pressed for time. We don't have a lot of time in coach licensing to really get in depth on this stuff. And it's important that you know it. I like to use the phrase that, you know, whether we like it or not, as coaches, we are fitness coaches, because you don't have a fitness coach with you all the time planning. So you're the one that's planning. And, you know, if you don't learn how to plan, then, you know, it's possible your planning is not going to be optimal. So you will learn anatomy, physiology, biomechanics specific to soccer, much more detail than we talked about today. You get theory and practical, okay, in the class and on the field and video, everything about how to do exactly what I talked about, training the energy systems on the field with the ball. There's specific, you know, detailed information about warm-ups, about physical literacy, coordination, strength training. You learn all, you know, kind of the pieces to the puzzle of an optimal training program. Fitness assessment I didn't mention, but it's in there too. Okay, and of course we talk a lot about periodization, and in addition, just like we're going to talk about right now in the last 10-15 minutes, also about monitoring, you know, planning, monitoring, and tracking training load, both with and without technology. And I'm going to give you some examples today of how to do it without technology. Okay, there's the link. Of course, you know, Matt and everybody at Ontario Soccer, I'm sure will follow up. Our start dates are coming up, right? So you do have you know, a little bit of time. If you're interested, there's still space available. It's almost full, but it's not full. So there is still space available. And we're starting in just a couple of weeks on Saturday, July 10th. And we've got kind of a hybrid, because of COVID and everything, we've got a hybrid of online webinars, in-person live instruction, which is coming in August. You've got assignments. There's all kinds of feedback you're going to get from me. It's a great course, of course, and hopefully maybe some of you might want to take advantage of it. So with that out of the way, let's get into training load, okay? Remember I said we have to know what it is that we're planning in order to plan it. And I've spoken a little bit about intensity, and I've given you the idea of, you know, everything being like a wave and all that. But, you know, what does that mean, that high point in the wave? What does the low point mean? And traditionally, I would say maybe the old school way to do it without putting the effort into it is just to look and kind of guess based on how tired players look, maybe how sweaty they are. I mean, I say this stuff like it sounds silly, but this is stuff I've actually heard, you know, coaches and say to me when I was a player and all that. So it's like this was, you know, the way it was done before. It's kind of like guessing. And, you know, again, this is, you know, my opinion in you know, as a professional that does this for a living. Guessing, you know, in high performance soccer, it's not acceptable. It's not acceptable to just say, well, we played for 5 minutes and we rested for 2 minutes and we did that, you know, 4 times. I know how intense that game was. You don't. First of all, of course, just in general, you don't know. And second of all, you know, even if you've seen a research study that showed a game 4v4 for that amount of time and that it trained the aerobic system, you don't know how your players responded to it. Because your player's response has to do not only with their fitness level, but also even with other things. Maybe they had, you know, they have 1 or 2 that had a bad night's sleep. Maybe some are dealing with some other issues that are affecting them and their heart rate was much higher or their physiological response was much higher. there's all, maybe they had after school sports or other stuff going on. Maybe they're dealing with an injury that's making it harder for them to train. Maybe they're playing in the game and they're hiding and they're not working very hard. These are all things that are only recognizable, that you can only discover about your training if you monitor. So guessing is not acceptable. And again, unless you've got a fitness coach with you every single training session, the only person that is capable to do it, and therefore the only person that's responsible to do it, is you. And so again, it's, when I say whether we like it or not, we're all fitness coaches putting the time and energy and effort. And, I recognize that it's effort, right? It's a little bit of extra effort that if you're not doing it already, it's extra effort, right? But putting that effort in is invaluable, because without it, you actually can't plan or periodize anything. You don't know whether or not your plan is even working. You have no idea. You're guessing, and guessing is not acceptable. So that's why, I'm so passionate about this topic. That's why we're going to talk about it now. Here's a way to do it that does not require any investment in technology, heart rate, GPS, accelerometers, nothing. It just requires an investment of time. That's all, a little bit of time. So here's how you do it. You calculate training load, TL, based on this formula, V times I, where V is volume. That's the number of active time in minutes. It's not the number of your training, number of minutes of your training session. You may train 90 minutes, but you understand that, of course, after the warm up, there's a water break and there's breaks in between exercise. And so it's the active time in minutes. And I is intensity, which is scored by asking each player to score their intensity based on this RPE, as you can see on the right, rating of perceived exertion. What is rating of perceived exertion? Literally means the player's rating of their perception of how hard they exerted themselves. I like to explain it by saying you're asking a player to tell you, how hard was that workout? How hard was that training? And it's done. There's a few different scales. I like the scale 0 to 10, because that scale 0 to 10, I find it's very intuitive for any player, even a beginner that's never seen this before. What does 7 out of 10 mean? Well, on the scale, it means very hard, but intuitively, 7 out of 10 means 70%. 9 out of 10 means 90%, etc. Even a young player, and I say this because I've done it with thousands of players, okay? Even a young player can figure this out fairly quickly, and they can give you an honest answer. So how do you calculate training load? You take the active time in minutes. That, again, my best advice, you get yourself a stopwatch, or it's you or your assistant or your manager, somebody. Start the watch every time the players are moving. When the warm-up starts, stop it every time there's a break. At the end of the 90 minutes, you may end up with 60 or 75 or 55, whatever it is, right? You calculate, the amount of time that they're moving. That's your volume. And intensity, again, this is unique and individual to every player. So volume is typically, it's for the whole team, unless you have someone that did extra or didn't, but you can keep track of that. But in any case, volume is for the team. Intensity is unique to the individual. So you can simply, as you see the coach here, on your clipboard, on one side of it, you print this document. Matt, I'm going to send it out as a PDF if coaches want it, okay? Stick it to one side of the clipboard, and on the other side, you make yourself a little spreadsheet or table with players' names as rows and columns with every day of the week or every day of training. And you record. Make sure, again, in my course, I mentioned this quite often, right? Do not ask players in a group. Take them individually. Why? Because these numbers are contagious, especially with younger players. The moment one person says 7, all of a sudden, the next one is also 7 and 7, and then you're going to end up with a bunch of 7s. Take them aside. It takes only, a few seconds. Is this some extra effort? Well, yes, of course it is, because you have to time your training and you have to record, you have to speak to each player before they leave. How much effort is it? Well, it's probably an extra 5 or 10 minutes per training session. That's all. And then, if you like to use Excel or, you're comfortable, you can of course do it. It's a little bit of extra time. This is a great task to assign to a manager or assistant coach or intern or even a player that wants to help out, or anyone, a parent even. Okay. My only advice with this is because often I do get some resistance when I teach this to coaches, that they'll start to say, well, I don't have time for this. And so my only advice is, if you recognize that it's important, which it is, because honestly, we're talking about periodization. We can't talk about it unless you do this. There's no sense talking about periodization unless you do this. So it is important. So if you recognize it's important, find a solution rather than just finding problems. There has to be a solution where you can do this. Doesn't take a lot of time. In a minute, I'll speak to, a little solution that I came up with that you can try if you want, but if you don't, you can just write it down. So that's it. That's training load. You track it every single day. Okay. So that leads to some frequently asked questions. You want to track it, but of course you're going to plan your training load based on those numbers. So these are the questions that come up. Okay. First of all, what's a good training load? What's good? Like, how do I know? Like, first of all, if I'm planning a session, do I want that training load to be 10,000? Do I want it to be 500? What's good? And second, how do I progress it? How do I follow that principle of progression that we talked about? So we make small incremental increases and we vary it throughout the week so you get that wave-like pattern, right? How do we do those things? So first of all, the first question, what's a good training load? Okay, here's the best answer that I can give you for that. You're going to use the game as a benchmark. What I mean by that is your training load, your number, volume multiplied by intensity, should never be higher than it is in a full 90-minute game. What's the game? It's 120 minutes of volume. Why? Because it's 90 minutes of playing plus a 30-minute warm-up. And the intensity should be 10 out of 10. Okay? I'm speaking anecdotally, but from, over 10, 12 years of experience doing this at every level, almost always, except for the goalkeepers, players rate games as 10 out of 10. It shouldn't be surprising, because a game is 90 minutes of maximal competition against an opponent. It's very rarely that a player finishes a 90-minute game. They might give you a 9, and again, goalkeepers sometimes lower. Brian doesn't want to hear me say this, but goalkeepers don't run. So they don't rate the game as high. So 120 multiplied by 10, that's 1200. That's the highest training load value you should see. And of course, remember that in a week, how many of those training loads do you want in a week? Well, you want only 2. So if the game is 1, there's only room for 1 more. If it's a preseason, and we'll talk about that, in a week where you don't have games, you can have 2 of those. You really don't want more than 2. Okay, so that's the first kind of answer to that question. And the second, just to build on that, you can set bandwidths or categories or thresholds for different values. And this is the way I like to do it. Okay, low is 1 to 300. That's low. Light, that's higher than low. These are just words, right? I mean, it's in the end, it's the numbers that mean more. 301 to 600. Okay, the next block of 300. Moderate will be 601 to 900, and then high 900 to 1200. So again, high, you don't want more than 2. Can you have 2 high and 1 moderate in a week? Absolutely. You still, you want to make a wave-like pattern, and I'll give you just some simple, guidelines for how to do that in a minute, but that's it. Use the game as the benchmark and then set categories for values. Keep in mind, you can plan this, but if you plan it and you don't monitor it, all you're doing is guessing. Not acceptable, and it makes the whole exercise more or less pointless. You don't want to plan and not monitor. So you have to monitor to check whether or not things went according to plan. Often they don't. Okay, here's an example. This is taken directly from my work with the Ottawa Fury. Okay, so I'm giving you, my secrets for how I planned 1 week of training. Monday, this is just an example. Monday was the day after a game. Okay, it was a recovery day. 30-minute, it was a recovery session. They did a bike, some mobility, and then they were in the ice bath. Okay, the average intensity out of 10 was 4. There's your training load, 120. It's low. Tuesday was the first day on the field, but it was only a 60 minutes active time. Remember, 90 minutes training, 60 minutes active. We trained the aerobic system. Okay, remember back to nonlinear model. Soccer needs multiple systems, etc. Okay, intensity was fairly high. Average was 7. Okay, so the load was 420. So we're getting higher than Monday for sure. Wednesday we did the lactic system, and funny enough that the team I worked with, we actually did like to press. So this was actually a pressing session, 70 minutes volume total. The intensity overall was 9. It was so higher volume, higher intensity. What do you get? You get higher training load, 630. So it was climbing. Okay. Thursday, back down. We trained the alactic system, lower volume, lower intensity, lower training load. So we're starting to see a wave happening here. Friday, again, back to the aerobic system again. Now you'll see already, okay, from Monday to Friday, we've got all 3 energy systems being trained in 1 week. This is optimal for soccer because soccer requires all 3 systems. You don't want to neglect them. That's why the nonlinear model makes sense. 50 minutes only, but the intensity was higher. So we built up, a little bit more training load again. Saturday, another low load. This was mostly like, the day before the game. We did a warm up, we did some speed and agility stuff, and then set pieces. 40 minutes, low intensity, training load was low. And finally, Sunday, here's the game. And, actually, funny enough, this particular game, the average was 9. Why was the average 9? Because there's substitutes that came in and played only, 30 minutes and goalkeepers. So, of course, that sometimes takes the average down. The center backs, I think, were a little lower on that one, too. Okay, so that's an example. Do you have to do it like this? Of course not. There's a million ways that you can plan your week. But you can see in this week, okay, there were only 2 days. Actually, there was only 1 day where the load was high because even the Wednesday, we would call that load moderate based on my calculation, right? Because it's higher than 600, but it's not higher than 9. But it still followed a wave-like pattern. This is the way to do it. It's an example. Of course, as I said, you can, with a little bit of time and energy and effort into planning, you can come up with thousands of ways to do it. But this is the way to do it with the nonlinear model. Hope that makes sense. Okay, so we'll move on. Okay, to the second question, which is about progressing from week to week. Again, it's an oversimplification in the interest of time, but it goes back to the principle of progression. You have to do things to your training sessions to change them and make them incrementally more challenging from 1 week to the next. So you follow the staircase model, small incremental increases in volume or intensity. How can you do that? Well, here's simple examples. You want to increase volume, you add time. Instead of playing for 3 minutes, you play for 3.5 or 4. You add repetitions. Instead of doing 2 reps or 3, you do 4. You add. I'll caution you, sometimes adding volume, adding volume is always going to affect training load more than adding intensity. There's nothing wrong with it. You just have to make sure, remember, if you double the volume, all of a sudden, because the formula is volume multiplied by intensity, but volume has a range from, 0 to 120 minutes, and intensity has a range only from 1 to 10. So because of that, increasing volume has a much greater effect on training load than increasing intensity. Nothing wrong with it. You just have to be cautious of it, or conscious of it, rather. Okay. Increasing intensity, lots of ways to do it. Again, these are just suggestions. You can increase or decrease field size. I say that because it depends. Sometimes increasing the field size makes more space for players just to hide in, whereas other times it makes more space for them to run in. Same thing with decreasing. Sometimes making a field smaller increases the intensity because the game speeds up. Sometimes, they just lose the ball. And so you have to, be aware of it. That's why you need to monitor also to see if it worked. You can decrease rest intervals. This is a great way. I really like to do this. I like to start with a small-sided game where there's only 2 minutes of rest, let's say, and then in week 2, I like to switch it to, are we, something happened here, I don't know. Okay. Can you still see me, Matt, and hear me?
Yeah, you're still good.
Oh, okay, yeah, so just saw something pop up on the screen, okay. So, back to what I said about, I like to start with a certain interval of rest, and then in the next week, I like to decrease it by a little bit, by 15 seconds or 30 seconds. And it doesn't sound like a lot, but remember, if the rest is only 2 minutes and you take down 30 seconds, you're taking 25% of the rest away. It has a significant impact on intensity. Are these the only ways to do it? No, there are thousands of ways. You can add conditions, minimize touches, make a rule that all the players in a small-sided game have to be over the half before they score, whatever it is. There's lots of ways to do it. These are just suggestions. And again, in the interest of time, we can't speak too much about the details. I can answer questions after if there are. And I said, for examples, well, if you want more examples, consider registering for the course. You'll get lots. So just a simple example of a month. Remember, we talked about kind of progressing from phase to phase. You can calculate your weekly total training load, and you can check to see, again, this is actually taken from my work with the Ottawa Fury. Okay, this was in season, it wasn't preseason. It's just an example. But we did 3 weeks where we, from week 1 to 2, we increased the weekly load by 5%, and then in week 3 by another 5%, and then in week 4, this is just a model. You don't have to do it this way; it's just a model. Week 4, we made it what's called a deloaded week, where we took it back down again by 15% actually, and then in week 5 we increased it again. So these are different ways to do it. It's a bit of an oversimplification, but if you plan training load and then you monitor and check to see what you got from your plan, then you can do this. You can accomplish these gradual progressive increases even from one phase to the next, or from 1 week to the next. Okay. So to wrap things up, as I said, this method of monitoring and tracking training load using volume multiplied by intensity, active time in minutes multiplied by rating of perceived exertion, it's something I've used at literally every single level I've worked at. That includes things like the national team where we had technology. We still did this. And then of course other environments, including the Ottawa Fury. You'd be surprised, right? Not all top level pro clubs, and certainly not over the world. When I was in Uruguay, nobody had it. So not all top level organizations have either the access to the technology or want to spend the money on it. So often you're left, and of course in the amateur environment almost nobody does. So often you're left with the low tech solution. So I thought, well, I want to plot these things. I want to track this information. So what's the best way for me to do this, without Excel? There must be a better way. I hooked up with a developer and I built this product called Sports Recovery Tracker. What does it keep track of? Primarily with regards to training load, it gives you information about the ratio between the acute workload. The acute workload is what you did today, and the chronic workload, which is the average workload that you got over the past 3 weeks. You can extend that to 4 weeks or 5 weeks. Anyway, I take 3 weeks. I like that in soccer. It gives you about, almost a month or so. So it's called the acute to chronic workload ratio. You can see in the graph on the left that there's a sweet spot, the green, where that ratio, and again, that's the ratio of the training load, the ratio between the training load that you did today and the average load that you've had over the last 3 weeks. And when that ratio is between 0.8 and 1.5, or even 1.3, let's say, then that's called the sweet spot. That's where you don't get overtraining and you don't get undertraining. You get enough overload to stimulate improvement. You get in the middle, but you don't get so much that you're in the danger zone. Simply put, what that means is if your training today was 0.8 to 1.3 times what you've been doing over the past 3 weeks, you're good. If your training load today was 1.5 times or greater what you've been doing over the last 3 weeks, then you're in the danger zone. You're in that overtraining zone. Doesn't mean it's guaranteed that you're going to cause injury, but the risk goes up. Remember the person going from one step all the way up to 5. That's what you're doing if your acute to chronic workload ratio gives you a number of 1.5 or higher. And I put these numbers in myself just to test it. This is an example on the right of what the app actually shows you. And you can see right around day 7, what happened? The acute to chronic workload ratio went from an average of 1, which is excellent, to an average of 3. That's an extreme. I mean, that's kind of crazy. Those players are all probably in the hospital by now. But again, these are fake data that I use just to show you. But this is an example. You don't want that. You don't want that jump that you see on day 7. And this is a way, of course, that you can track that and record it. Okay. Again, that's just the ratio between acute training load and chronic. Like I said, the app, in addition to tracking training load, also allows you to track other metrics if you want, like recovery, hydration, and injury status. That's a URL. Again, it's a product. There's a small fee to it. It costs, per player, it costs $1 per month. So each player would pay $12 per year. Again, it's an app, it's a business. There has to be a fee, but I wanted to make it something which was affordable for players. So it's not very expensive. That's the URL where you can find out about it. These are just some pictures that show you a little bit more of the information that you get from it. if you want. If you don't want it, of course, you can just track it, as I said, by hand. There's nothing wrong with that. So to wrap it up again, as I said, we're talking about this 2-week preseason, and really, you've been given all the information already. So this is more of a summary than anything else. But here's the laws of periodization, the laws of the game. Here's what they are. There's 4 of them. Law number 1: no more than 2 high load days per week. If you do more than 2, you're very likely to get into that overtraining because players aren't going to recover. Limit to 2. Okay. Law number 2: follow each high load day with a low load day. That's very important. That gives you that wave-like pattern. So, if day 1 is high, day 2 can be low, and then day 3 can be moderate, and day 4 can be high again. It can look like the graph on the right? Follow each high load day with a low load day. Law 3, okay, you're going to aim, okay, it's sometimes hard to do this, but you can do it if you plan for it, to train both the aerobic and anaerobic energy systems each week. And if not each week, at least it has to be every other week. If you go more than 2 weeks, I'll tell you right now, if you go more than 2 weeks without training your aerobic system, you've lost fitness for sure. The anaerobic system, you can go a bit longer, but if you want high functioning, you want maintenance of speed and power, you want players to run fast and jump high, this stimulus needs to be consistent. That's, again, why the nonlinear model makes sense, and why you want to train both systems every week. And finally, law number 4, you're going to add or increase by approximately 5 to 10% training load from week 1 to week 2. And if we go to longer than 2-week preseason, well, you can do the same thing if you want in week 3. Of course, you're going to plan to do that, but the only way that you know whether or not you achieve that objective is by monitoring. And that's why monitoring is so important, because it's the only way to check, has my plan improved? Has my training gone according to plan, and has my plan caused the improvements in fitness that I want? And if not, well, what do? You don't bury your head in the sand. You have operational flexibility, and you change your plan. So that's all we have for now. I said I wanted to finish at 1 o'clock, and here we are, 1:15, 1:16. So I'm a little behind, but I think I'm okay. Thank you again, everybody. As I said, it's a big topic, and it's kind of condensed into a short amount of time. Thank you for your time and commitment, of course, and I really do hope you got some good valuable information today.
Perfect. Thanks, Richard. I think we're at a good stage for time to close things off. So I just wanted to say again, thank you very much, Richard, for joining us today. We all know the importance of the information you imparted, and I'm especially confident now in speaking for the audience and saying that the season ahead doesn't feel quite as daunting now with this information and these tools. I hope you all take the opportunity to continue to lead your programs with the highest standards possible that you have done so to date, that will allow our players and the game itself to come back stronger than ever. Until then, stay well, stay safe, and we'll continue to pitch in and play on as we work to return to play. Thank you.